Okay, so we'll cover a gospel. And I'm not going to pretend that all of you know what that means. So we'll kind of go back to the beginning. The Bible is separated into two parts. The Old Testament, which is like pre-Jesus, and then the New Testament, which is post-Jesus. And the first four books of the New Testament or the Gospels, and they are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They cover the life of Jesus. So some of them go a little bit before the birth of Christ. They cover the conception of John the Baptist, and when the angel came to Zachariah and Elizabeth and discussed the conception of John the Baptist and uh, through the pregnancy. So it's a little bit before Jesus's birth. Um, and they go, all of them go up to Jesus dying, resurrecting, and then ascending back into heaven. So you have four separate accounts you know, of the of Jesus's life. Matthew, I'm not even gonna lie to you, but I know that Matthew and John and I believe Mark were disciples, and Luke was not a disciple. He was like, I would say like the next, you know how like in the Catholic Church you could have like the priest and then you can have the deacons, or like in our church we have like Pastor Matt and the elders. I would say Luke would be one of those people who was like an elder or like a deacon, you know. But Matthew was an actual disciple. Nikki says in the comments, I love Matthew in The Chosen. If you've watched The Chosen, Matthew is kind of depicted like a little bit of a nerdy guy, you know. I really love the way the producer in The Chosen kind of presents Matthew to the audience. Okay, so who is Matthew? Um, Matthew is a tax collector. That is the description that the um, all the gospels give him. And that doesn't mean a whole lot to me and you. So again, the Bible was written for us. It wasn't written to us. So you need to understand that back then, okay, so at this time, the Jews, God's chosen people, are in under Roman rule. Okay. So they're part of the Empire of Rome, which like really kind of makes them angry, if I'll be completely honest. Because the Roman rule, like the Jews felt like they could govern themselves. We've talked before about how they kind of had two governmental authorities over them. So like y- in the United States, let's think about us. We have like the federal government, we have the state government, but overall, it's the government, right? But if you were part of a church, we don't think that way, but this is the way they thought. You were under the rule of your church. So you had like governmental rule and then like church rule. But back then, you need to understand that the churches had much more power over people than our churches do now. So, like, they could, I mean, really, according to their rules, like, if you violated a Jewish law, you could be like, I'm gonna give you an example. Like, if you committed adultery, you could be stoned to death under the Jewish rules. And then I don't even know what the Roman rules were for that. So you need to understand that's kind of the world these people are living in, right? They have governmental authority, which is Rome, and then they have Jewish authority, which is like their church. But the Jews felt like they could govern themselves. They didn't need governmental authority because they lived their life to a higher standard than the Romans had required of them. They thought they were like better than everybody else. But God did call them his chosen people. So, I mean, I understand where they were going with that. Um, Okay, so back to Matthew. Back then, the Rome would collect taxes, okay? So when they would collect taxes, they would hire, and listen, in my Bible commentary, they have the name of it, but um, Rome would hire, like, I'm gonna say a company. Let's just pretend that's the way it is. Rome would hire a company for a particular district to collect taxes, okay? Then that company would hire a person who lived in that community to actually perform the tax collecting. Okay. So let's pretend that the taxes were 10%. I'm just coming up with a number. So Rome says, okay, ABC company, you need to collect 10% of taxes in this community, but you can collect, um, 15%, and you give us, Rome, 10 and you keep 5, okay? As like payment for collecting taxes. So what would happen is ABC company would hire a local person to actually collect the taxes, and that person would often charge the people like 20%. So the people would be paying 20% of taxes, 5% would go to the local person, 5% would go to the company, and then the 10% would go to Rome. So imagine what this person, this local person's reputation would be among his peers. Not good. They, all the local people, Jews and Gentiles, hated local tax collectors because number one, they were one of them. They were a local person. And they thought them as like thieves, like they were stealing money that didn't belong to them. And like, listen, they were like hustlers. Like they would get the money out of you. And what would happen is like, back then if you owed money, you could be arrested if you owed taxes like that. Like you could go into a debtor's prison, which doesn't make sense to me because if I'm in jail, I can't really earn money to pay you taxes, but whatever. Anyway, that was Matthew's job. He was a local tax collector. So you would imagine that in his community, Matthew was not very well liked. And I would tend to imagine that he felt that being ostracized by everyone else. But I want you to also realize that tax collectors were very wealthy because they kind of, you know, for lack of a better word, screwed other people out of money. And so they had um they were wealthy on the backs of their neighbors. Okay. So you would see why all the local people didn't really like him. Um, and when looking at the outcasts of society in that time, you would see like, prostitutes were not very well favored. Um, People who out it wouldn't be drug addiction, but people who were, maybe alcoholics or, they would call them sinners in the Bible. Um, and then tax collectors. They say this all the time. They group those people together, when talking about, the Jews kind of thought they were better than everybody else. So they were like, they lived what they thought to be righteous, um, which means that they believed that they lived a life pleasing to God. And people who didn't live a life pleasing to God were less than them, and they were better. And so the Jews thought they were better than Matthew, as a tax collector. Um, Nikki said Matthew was a tax collector. His story is amazing, and he was autistic. So I don't know, I mean, there was no like formal evaluation of Matthew, but he definitely has, in reading the Bible commentary, he definitely had a different way of thinking. Like he very much paid a lot of attention to detail. And we see this in his gospel. And so it's not like just a made up idea. Matthew pays attention to things that the other gospel writers don't pay attention to. He was very good at math. Um, Now, when you watch The Chosen, I do think that the writer, that producer, tries to portray him like I think he's using a little bit of poetic justice there. Like the Matthew on The Chosen and the Matthew in the Bible may be the same person, but I'm not 100% sure. So just letting you know. But it's important to know who he was because like the other disciples didn't like him, and I think that's important in looking at his gospel that, not only did Jesus allow tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes and all these, unsavory people of society to follow him and be his innermost people. Um, he chose Matthew for a purpose. He had that. Jesus knew who Matthew was. He knew what job he held. And he knew Matthew was not well liked in his community. And Jesus knew that Matthew wouldn't be well liked among the disciples. They felt like he had betrayed them, because he was working for Rome. And so it's awesome, I think, that in the first gospel, Jesus is using a person who was not well liked and who was identified as an outcast of society. And we see this again and again that Jesus will constantly use people who are not perfect in an effort to bring forth his story to the nations. And I think he used one of the perfect, he used a perfect person for that job, not in the fact that Matthew's perfect, but Matthew had a very good skill set to be able to tell this story. So I like that about him. Right. Nikki said he scribed for Jesus when he would speak to the Jewish people. The tension between him and Peter was thick, thick. So in The Chosen, they create a storyline. And I think that the producer of The Chosen is very right in his the example that he gives, like his theory about Matthew's relationship with the other disciples is very well founded in scripture. Okay. We know that from scripture, and from history, tax collectors were hated. And what the writer, that not the writer, but the producer in The Chosen did was he created a storyline where Peter owed taxes and Matthew is a tax collector. And when Jesus sends out the disciples two by two to go minister to the areas around where they were, he sends those two out together. And Peter hates Matthew. And poor Matthew, like it's over his head. Um, so I love that he puts them together. I feel like when we read scripture, we read line by line and we see the facts for what they are. And sometimes it's hard for us to read in between the lines and see that, God put a bunch of imperfect people together in an effort to bring forth the gospel. And that may not have been a very easy task, And so I think to myself, like, sometimes God puts me in situations with people who I don't like, or I think that, you know, God shouldn't use for his purpose. And when I have, personality conflicts with them, I don't, in just reading the gospel, I don't think you get that from just reading the facts. You kind of have to read between the lines and see, these 12 disciples were put on a task to share, to follow Jesus and then start the church and go out and preach and spread Christianity. And they probably didn't get along with each other. And so, when my husband and I are bickering at each other, and I think to myself, like, Lord, you put us on this task together, and you know how hard-headed he is, and you know how I am. Why would you put the two of us together? You know what I mean? I mean, listen, we've all been there. Um, but I mean, what a beautiful thing. Jesus did it in the past with the disciples, and he's doing it in your own marriage, or he's doing it in your own workplace, So Um, it's good. It's good that people challenge us sometimes, just like Matthew probably challenged a lot of the other disciples. Okay, so we know I was looking at, I'm in NIV. Okay, that's the version that I'm reading. So, um, one thing I want us to know ahead of time, I think it's important that we know when we read the different gospels, they all have kind of like an overarching theme. John's one is that like he writes his gospel so that people might believe in Jesus. Okay. So he comes at it from one like aspect. Like that is kind of the thread that runs through um the Gospel of John. If there was a thread that I could say ran through the Gospel of Matthew, it would be the fulfillment of Old Testament scripture. Okay. We will see so many times in the book of Matthew. And I think that's how we said that he had a different thought process and he paid attention to these details that maybe other gospel writers didn't. This is one of those aspects of that. He, okay, so think about if I'm an Old Testament Jew, right? Up until the birth of Jesus. If I'm living in that time and I have knowledge of my scripture, I know that the prophets have been foreshadowing this Messiah to come, okay? And there are a bunch of different little prophecies that are made about who he is, where he's going to come from, how he's going to be birthed, what he's going to do on earth, how he's going to die. So they're just understand they kind of had pieces to the puzzle, right? But they couldn't put it all together. And so each of them kind of put it together in their own head about what the Messiah was going to look like, but none of them had an accurate picture. Okay. Um, so that's kind of what's happening in their thought process, at the time. They kind of knew what he was going to look like, but they really didn't know at all. And so Matthew's job he has taken on in the book of Matthew is in telling Jesus' story from, conception. He constantly will say, this is what happened, and this is a fulfillment of that promise. So he'll say, in the Old Testament, it was said blank, and this is why Jesus fulfills that prophecy. So we see in John and Luke and Mark that many times they'll say that, it was a fulfillment, but not as much as Matthew. He will constantly make those connections for us. Um, and so understand that to whom he was writing were Jewish people. So he would say, hey, Jewish person, remember in the Old Testament when this prophet said that? This is why Jesus is the Son of God. This is why he is the Messiah that you've been waiting for. And so it's a constant, looking back. Um, and so John MacArthur uses the word kingship. He says that Matthew's gospel will constantly want to identify Jesus as kingship. And he does that through, um, explaining to the reader about the fulfillment of Old Testament promises. So just letting you know. I forget that like I'm a nerd, and so I think that these things are interesting. So I apologize if I bore you with details sometimes. Okay. So in NIV, we'll probably just get through this like little first part about the his lineage. So I'm not going to read all of it to you, but Matthew starts first thing, right out the gate, hitting the ground running. Go, Matthew. Um, Verses 1 through 16. Okay. Well, I'm going to say verse 17. So 1 through 17. Matthew starts off by giving the ancestry and lineage of Jesus back to Abraham. Okay. We know that Abraham is um like the person to whom the Old Testament covenant was given, right? That is the person in the Old Testament that God said, Abraham, you will be the father of my people, and through your descendants, the Messiah will come. And your descendants will be as plentiful as the stars in the sky and the sands on the beaches. And your descendants are going to be my chosen people. And he does make that promise that the Messiah will come from Abraham's lineage. And we've gone through the stories, and I'm not going to go through every person, but we've seen that, Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has Judah, and all the brothers. So we know that lineage all the way down. And it eventually gets to David in verse 6. So David is a direct descendant from Abraham. David was like King David. He's David and Goliath. He was a shepherd boy who slayed this giant he was a Philistine giant. Um, and he eventually becomes King David, the king, and he was loved by God and he was a righteous man. And we see in David's life that he made mistakes, just like Abraham. Abraham made mistakes too. He lied to government officials and told them that Sarah was his sister when she actually was his wife. And then we see the same in David when David falls in love with Bathsheba and he sees that she's married. So, as king, he sends her husband Uriah out to the front lines of battle so that he would be killed. And so Bathsheba would be a widow, and then now he could marry her. So, we see that these people are imperfect, right? Like they're not perfect people. And then we see in this lineage that it goes from Abraham to David, and then David to Jesus. And it's important to note that this lineage is, let's see, it goes through Joseph, and then it says the husband of Mary. Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So we're going to see that Joseph and Mary are getting married, and Joseph is Jesus's, what John MacArthur refers to as foster father. He is not his biological father, but he is the father who raises Jesus. Okay. This line of verses establishes Jesus's earthly lineage, right? So we know that Jesus holds this like crazy aspect of his DNA that he is fully man and fully God. So he is the pastor that I would that like introduced me to the real Jesus, Pastor Ray Vornado. He's the man who married my husband and I. He is like a spiritual leader in my life. And he would say all the time that Jesus is God incarnate, which means that he is the tangible love of God. God loved us so much. The example of God's love, the thing that we can touch, the tangible thing is Jesus, this newborn, fresh little wrinkly baby. That is the tangible love of God who, willingly gives his life up for us while he's alive. But he is fully man. He is the product of Mary, and he is fully God. He is the product of God. And so he holds those two aspects. And I want you to see that in these verses, 1 through 17, we're covering Jesus's earthly human lineage. Um, and in the Old Testament, we see that God made these promises to Abraham and David that through their offspring would be the Messiah. And it is true. Through the offspring, through their offspring is the Messiah. And again, I guess don't understand, like I'm not the person to whom this was written. So I didn't understand like why that would be important. Like, why is it important to talk about Jesus's lineage? Well, the first thing is because there were Old Testament prophecies about who the Messiah was going to be and where he was going to come from, Matthew thinks it's very important to let the reader know he has fulfilled the ancestry prophecies. Okay, so we know that there was a promise in the Old Testament two times, Abraham and David, that the Messiah would come from their lineage. And lo and behold, Jesus can check those boxes. He did that. He met those requirements. The second is at that time, it was like, I feel like you and I maybe are not that way, but they were. Their ancestry meant everything to them. Way back, once the Jews stop wandering in the desert and actually make it into the promised land, the land is split up into different areas, which were for different tribes of Israel. So we know, Jacob's children, the 12 tribes of Israel, um, they had logistical sections of the promised land, okay? And in order to prove where you should live, you had to prove your lineage back to that tribe, and then that was where you went to live. We saw this in the New Testament when the census was taken, and Joseph and Mary have to go back to Joseph's hometown to do the census. That was because of his lineage back to whatever tribe he belonged to. Okay, so that's why he had to go back to Bethlehem. So, you and I don't have to track our lineage in an effort to show where we should live or who we are. But back then that was very important. And so I love that Matthew like uses that as justification why Jesus is who he says he is, like right out the gate. Like he's like, we want to talk about birthrights and stuff and who he is. Let's look first at his ancestral lineage. He can check those two boxes. So that's probably a good stopping point for us today. So I'm going to stop recording. Tomorrow we will, I would say, probably get through the rest of chapter 1 of the book of Matthew. So from verses 18 through 25. So if y'all want to read ahead a little bit, we will look at that tomorrow. So I'll let y'all go. Y'all have a good day.